director of the program on Central Asia at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies. Uh, Thank you for joining our event today. It is a very exciting event. It's a book event. It's a book launch. We have Bradley Jardine and Edward Lemon with us today, and they will present their brand new book called Backlash: China's Struggle for Influence in Central Asia, that has just been published by Oxford University Press. I will not talk about the book because the authors will do it much better, will present it much better. But I want to note that it's a very, very impressive undertaking. It draws on decades of research, on a lot of field work all over Central Asia in its most remote corners. Um, it weaves many important themes, and it puts forward thought-provoking arguments. So congratulations, big congratulations to you both. So without further ado, let me introduce the speakers in the order they will speak. I will start with Bradley Jardine, who is a political risk analyst, strategic consultant, and managing director of the Oxford Society for Central Asian Affairs. He's a former fellow at the Wilson Center and served as editor of the Moscow Times in 2016-2018. His work appears in Time, the Wall Street Journal, The Economist, Nikkei Asia, The Atlantic, and Foreign Policy, and also on the BBC and CNN. A very warm welcome, Bradley.
Thank you, Nargis.
Then we will go to Dr. Edward Lemon, who is a research assistant professor at the Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M University, and also Washington, D.C. teaching site, and president of the Oxford Society for Central Asian Affairs. He was previously a Mellon postdoctoral fellow at the Harriman Institute at Columbia University, and he received his PhD from the University of Exeter in 2016. And in his research, he examines China and Russia's relations with Central Asia, authoritarian governments, religion, security, and migration in Eurasia. So very warm welcome to you as well, Edward.
Thanks, Nargis. Thanks for having us.
Okay, let's go to the presentation. Bradley, the floor is yours.
Sure. Well, thanks again for having us. We really appreciate it. And it's exciting to finally be able to share our new book with everyone. As you've mentioned, we've spent over a decade really thinking about this topic. In the past decade, we've really seen China emerge as the key actor in Central Asia. And it's been a very fascinating trend to observe. We've spent a decade going back and forth in the region, working on it, traveling, as you mentioned, to very remote corners, to the major city centers, and really talking and trying to understand China's role, its ambitions in the region, and more importantly, as we try to explore in this book, how it's being perceived. Despite the title Backlash, we don't just focus on negative perceptions of China. Of course, there are plenty of people who have positive receptions. And as we know, one of the main overwhelming kind of takeaways from fieldwork is often that people are more likely to be ambivalent or have no strong opinions on China either way. And I think that that's a perspective that we try to convey, as well as that China's engagement, despite its vast investments, its increasing security dealings in the region, it still remains quite minor in terms of soft power. It has a long way to go in terms of its outreach to Central Asians. And oftentimes, this lack of outreach has actually created something of an information vacuum. It's very easy to create negative perceptions of China or disseminate even disinformation about Chinese projects. So China's quite vulnerable in that regard. I guess we can go to the next slide. Another big theme of the book that's important is that we talk more about Central Asia as a critical region for where China likes to test ideas and concepts. From early economic outreach in the early 90s to the launch of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is China's first real multilateral fora, which was very important development for China at the time, the launch of the BRI. These are often tested in Central Asia first before they're rolled out to other parts of the world. And that's interesting for a number of reasons. I mean, first, of course, Central Asia is where we can really see how China's thinking about the world and the concepts it's testing. But we also, it's a place where, because it's the first to receive some of these policies, it's also the first place where China experiences critical feedback loops. It changes and alters its plans as it engages Central Asia. And in a lot of ways, as the region where it first moves on policies, those are then refined and shaped before they reach other strategic regions, whether it's Africa or Latin America. So Central Asia is very important for that reason. And furthermore, as China engages with Central Asia, we often think in terms of, especially today in Washington, D.C., great power relations. It's always that the great power itself is a driving force in politics and policies, and its smaller regions like Central Asia are merely recipients. We kind of flip that narrative throughout this book, making clear that by engaging Central Asia is also engaging China. It's changing how China thinks about the world. It's changing and adapting Chinese concepts and approaches. It's also leading to China adapting some of its policies, like the Belt and Road, to be more accommodating to local needs. Because if it doesn't accommodate, then it will just create pushback, and it will actually make its own role in the region very difficult. So it's actually that adaptation is very important, and that does give a lot of local agency. So exploring Central Asia's approaches, what Central Asians want, is also very important and often overlooked part of discourse when we look at China's engagement with the world. So this book was kind of an attempt to do that, not merely looking at elite politics or how elites engage with China, but thinking about locals. What we found time and time again, now Ed and I, this works based on a decade of research building large data sets, whether it's mapping Chinese military transfers or geospatially tracking thousands of protests that have taken place across Central Asia. What we found is a compelling story where you see clusters of protests and activism, largely around Chinese projects, especially mining projects, due to a lot of ecological damage and such things. So people have actually, on the ground, forced Chinese projects to close or sometimes to adapt and to change and accommodate their needs more. So I think that was important, was bringing local activists back into the narrative, that Central Asians, despite their restrictive authoritarian context, they can still operate and challenge and create pushback for large macro investments and so on. So I think that that's very important, was bringing Central Asians back in the narrative, and making clear that by engaging with Central Asians are also engaging with China, and China is changing and adapting too. It's a two-way process, or as we would call it, negotiated hegemony, where large actors have to deal and accommodate with the needs of small states. We can flip to the next slide. So without that, I'll start kind of talking about main arguments of the book. I mean, before we can really outline our core arguments, it's crucial to first explore, what does China want in Central Asia? What are its key objectives? So there are a number of points that we kind of break down. I mean, the first is, of course, domestic developments. In part of the inspiration, at least for my interest in this project, was the humanitarian crisis that was taking place in the neighboring Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. Tracking the detainment of ethnic Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, as well as, of course, Uyghurs, developed, in my mind, a lot of interest in how Kazakhstan became almost a window to what was happening across the border. A lot of international reporters were traveling to Kazakhstan to speak with people who had been fleeing Xinjiang. So it became quite important is to understand the interlinkage between this very sensitive region in China and the neighboring Central Asia. And of course, those perceptions are very important to China's understanding of the region, its place in the region. That as China engages Central Asia, it's through Xinjiang. And so the developments that are taking place in Xinjiang were, of course, going to have spillover effects in Central Asia. So in terms of Xinjiang, China has really viewed Central Asia as a region for opportunity and also of threats. The opportunity side Xinjiang is very remote. China's great economic growth over the past decades is largely concentrated in its eastern coastal regions. So that's left development behind in regions like, in the sparsely populated regions like Xinjiang, Inner Mongolia, Tibet. So by encouraging economic outreach, there was a hope that integrating Xinjiang with Central Asia could lead to economic growth and therefore pacify any protests or unrest. On the threat side, there's been, with the opening of the borders, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, fears of the potential for Uyghur nationalist sentiments or Islamism. So China's, from the very 90s onward, has tried to kind of control civic space in Central Asia, use its leverage economically, politically, on the governments of the region to crack down on any potential for transnational nationalist organization or political movements. So Central Asia serves as both an opportunity for development, also potential threat, is how China perceives it. Stability also comes from, of course, like-minded states. Central Asia's authoritarian secular political systems very much pursue the same objective and goals as China, maintaining them, supporting the regimes, getting diplomatic support, the United Nations, and so on, have been very central to China. So accommodating Central Asia politically has been to China's advantage as well. Of course, energy security, another key element that's talked in grand strategy all the time. We talk about the so-called Malacca dilemma, where in the potential conflict between the West and China, it'd be very easy to shut down shipping of energy supplies. So there was always a strategic thinking in China that finding land corridors through Eurasia, particularly with Central Asia, develop alternative supply routes and alternative supplies would give it more strategic flexibility. Similarly, in the early 90s, one of the first things China really needed to negotiate with the region was, of course, border negotiations. And also, because of the Sino-Soviet split, there was a lot of tension in Central Asia. This was quite a militarized frontier. In order to create strategic depth for China, China wanted to be able to demilitarize its borders with Central Asia and with Russia so it could reallocate its security resources to more critical regions, such as the Asia Pacific. So demilitarizing the border was also part of its diplomatic outreach in the early 90s. Of course, establishing transit routes. With the onset of the BRI, China's wanted to develop a lot more global connectivity, challenging US-centric and usually maritime routes for global trade by creating alternative corridors such as through the Belt and Road and also through alternative naval supply chains as well. So Central Asia has been core for this. As it's important to mention, when I said about Central Asia being a testing ground, of course, the BRI was rolled out in Kazakhstan. So that's very important symbolically, but also in terms of its major strategy that is trying to connect the Eurasian landmass. And then finally, of course, great power narrative, rolling out alternative organizations such as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization gives China a layer of diplomatic prestige. And that's also part of its agenda in establishing itself as a great power. We can go to the next slide. And Ed, I'll let you speak a little bit more about China's rise as an economic actor before we kind of get into looking at the political pushback in the region.
Sure. Well, wonderful. Well, thank you for having us today. So China's rise in the region as an economic player, of course, has been very dramatic. If we just look at the figures, 20 years ago in 2005, China's trade with Central Asia was 8.7 billion. We fast forward to last year, and the trade, according to the Chinese side, between Central Asia and China amounted to 94 billion. So that's an over tenfold increase over the past 20 years in terms of the trade with the region. It's become the largest trade partner for the region, overtaking Russia back in 2008. It's the largest investor in the region, as Bradley said, launching its flagship Belt and Road Initiative project at Nazarbayev University back in 2013. Increasingly, countries are becoming indebted to China, particularly Tajikistan, where about 60% of its external debt is to China, and Kyrgyzstan, where at 37% of foreign debt is to China. So with those opportunities, of course, of engagement with China come risks, and this will feed into some of the pushback and backlash that we'll talk about in the second half of the presentation. As Bradley said, of course, the focus of much of the Chinese investment has been in the energy sector. Not only in oil and gas, where CNPC controls something like 24% of Kazakhstan's total oil production, and 70% of Turkmen gas goes to China, but also increasingly, as I'll talk about later, in areas such as green energy and critical minerals. I think as this slide shows, this is the trade balance, or the external trade partners of the different Central Asian countries. This dependence on China does vary between different countries. As you can see, Turkmenistan, in terms of having its main export, i.e. gas going to China, means that it's the most dependent on trade with China. And these trades are often imbalanced insofar as China is exporting more to the region than it is importing. And as you can see, Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, the next most dependent on trade with China, and then Kazakhstan has a much more diversified portfolio. So we are interested in this book in the agency that states in Central Asia have, and of course that agency varies between different countries, between different areas, and Kazakhstan, and to a slightly less degree Uzbekistan, are the best placed to exercise agency within their relations with China. But ultimately, we're not only interested in China as an economic player. I think there's often been a misleading characterization of China's relationship with the region as being China is the primary economic partner, whereas Russia is the security partner. But in our book, we're particularly interested in showing how, as Bradley already alluded to, China's engagement with Central Asia since its independence in 1991 has really had key security and political components. And I'll hand back to Bradley to introduce those before we delve into them more deeply.
Yeah, we can move on to the next slide. So yeah, I think that's been an important part of what spearheaded this book was a data set we started building back in 2019 for the Kennan Institute, where we're looking at China's arms transfers in the region. And all our data, whether it's Chinese security exercises, arms transfers, really pointed to 2014 as being something of a turning point. It's where this logic of the so-called separation between China just being an economic actor, Russia being the main security partner, started to break down or be challenged somewhat. It's really where we saw a spike in arms transfers, military exercises, and that makes sense at the geopolitical level. China started to make a lot of statements about concerns about US withdrawal from Afghanistan, about the conflict in Syria, and the potential for spillover and unrest back to Central Asia, and then spilling over into Xinjiang. So China's relationship with the region became more securitized. 2014, it began its Strike Hard campaign in Xinjiang, where it was a mass repression of Uyghurs, which has accelerated to the re-education centers. So there was a lot of securitization of China's engagement, its security on the border, its monitoring of the region as well, and its cooperation agreements with local security partners. The picture there, that's one that I took actually during my field work. That's, of course, China's strategic reconnaissance facilities in the Pamir Mountains overlooking the Wakhan corridor. I think that's quite a stark example of what we kind of argue is somewhat of a domestically oriented engagement with security in the region. China's really thinking about its security of Xinjiang. It often has much narrower scope than Russia and other great powers in the region in terms of their military drills that they run. China's are often quite focused on the security services, as Ed will explain in more detail with reference to our data sets. But just setting the groundwork that this facility in the Pamirs is very important because it's one of only a few that China has in the world. Of course, Djibouti, talk of a naval port in Cambodia, but this reconnaissance facility in Tajikistan. And this is in a region that, of course, historically and even to the present, Russia considers to be its sphere of influence. And so it attracts quite a lot of attention that China has started to move into the realms of security in such a stark way, and challenging this status quo, which, there's a lot of talk here in DC. Does this mean tensions in the Sino-Russian dynamic? What are the long-term implications? So I think that this facility in particular is very important. We can go to the next slide. And yeah, that's just the quote we mentioned as an example of just 2014, these concerns that were being announced in our data, as Ed will now outline, kind of backs up 2014 as being an important year for China's emergence as a security actor. Your mic is off.
So China's rise as a security player in the region, much like its rise as an economic player, has been relatively swift and quite extensive. Russia remains the primary security player in the region, external security player in the region. It has 3 military facilities in 3 other different countries. Over half of the arms exports, if we go to the next slide, have come from Russia since 1991. This is the military base again that China has established. If we go to the next slide. So Russia remains the dominant partner. You can see in many of the graphics and in the data sets that we've collected, it's organized over half of the joint military exercises we've seen since 1991, just over half of the arms transfers. But China is playing an increasing role. So you can see China has accounted for 10% of, just over 10% of the arms transfers to Central Asia in terms of their dollar value between 1991 and 2021. But that percentage has increased. If we look at its historic role in the arms market, it was very marginal. Just between 2010 and 2014, it accounted for 1.5% of arms transfers to the region. But in the next 5-year period, it jumped to 13%. So over time, China has increasingly been sending not only different military hardware, but also increasingly surveillance technologies being employed in various smart cities as the Central Asian governments are looking to build more intelligent governance systems, looking to surveil their populations. China has been an eager partner in this regard. If we go to the next slide, it's also been increasing more and more exercises, military exercises in the region since its first military exercise back in 2002. Again, as part of this, what we've seen it doing over the past decade, which is increasingly going it alone with less deference to Russia. Since 2014, it's been organizing its own military exercises outside of the framework of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Initially, many of these exercises were organized within the SCO. Of course, Russia also being a member, it was to a degree signaling to Russia a degree of deference to Russia's historic role in the region. But increasingly, China is organizing its own initiatives, organizing its own exercises, its own providing military assistance to the region, security assistance, without being deferential to Russia. When Tajikistan established its military facility, China, established the military facility in Tajikistan a decade ago, we have reports that there were meetings between Chinese and Russian officials, effectively informing them, perhaps asking for permission to establish this facility. But increasingly, that logic no longer applies, and China is developing its own security linkages within the region. Next slide. As you can see, security has been on the agenda for China since the independence of Central Asia from the Soviet Union. Many of the early meetings, of course, were concerned with border security and delimiting those borders that went from being a Soviet border to suddenly being a border between 4 newly independent republics and China. We're particularly interested in ensuring that the region didn't become a haven for Uyghur separatists or terrorists, as China would frame them. And so really this idea that China has been a security player in the region more recently, it has become more intense, but ultimately it's been a security player in the region since the region's re-emergence to independence. So you can see multiple meetings with Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, fewer with Turkmenistan, of course. Turkmenistan, not a member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, a country that's been more reticent to engage internationally. But obviously, as we've seen in recent years, a country that is now engaging more on the international stage. Next slide. Many of these meetings have focused on concepts such as the Shanghai Spirit, the three evil forces of separatism, terrorism, and extremism. And we see a great degree of convergence in the agendas of these regimes, insofar as China's very happy to support the authoritarian governments of Central Asia. And next slide, Afghanistan has been a key focal point, as we said, very much the logic behind it, China establishing its military facility in the region, right on the border between China, Afghanistan, and Tajikistan near the Wakhan corridor, and very much a focus of China's growing security presence in the region, as we saw from the quote from Xi Jinping. There was a great concern in the Chinese government that as the ISIS was losing its territory in Syria back in 2014, we would see many of these Uyghur terrorist groups that were operating there migrate to Afghanistan and then cross the border into China. And so this is one of the reasons we saw China building and funding the construction of border posts on the Tajik-Afghan border, increasingly doing joint border patrols, establishing a military facility, and pumping more money to bolster the Tajik military forces, given that was the border that was most vulnerable from the Chinese perspective. And so since 2021, of course, we've seen China engaging with the new Taliban government and very much promoting a kind of Afghan-owned peace process in the country. But now I'll hand back to Bradley to talk about how this rising role is generating backlash.
Great, thanks for that, Ed. We can go to the next slide. So yeah, of course, we've looked at the macro level, looking at the great power relations, how China's increased as an economic security actor. But what we really bring with this book is more insight from on the ground field work and research into local perceptions. As I'll kind of unpack a little bit more, of course, we're looking at a lot of protest data and overt backlash to China. But it's not all we look at. Of course, we look at actors who are very receptive to China, very whether these are think tankers in the region or officials who have a pro-China sentiment. So we try to understand their motivations, their objectives. And of course, overwhelmingly, as we make clear, the vast majority of interviewees actually don't have strong opinions on China either way. There's actually a lot of ignorance and misunderstanding about China, and just a lack of personal engagement with it. But of course, ambivalence, China's struggle to be known, is less of a narrative hook than backlash in some ways. So in some ways, framing and trying to understand and unpack the negative sentiments is a more interesting academic puzzle. We can go to the next slide. So this is one of our maps. So what we've been doing for years at Oxford Society is geospatially mapping thousands of protests that have been taking place in Central Asia since 2019, especially in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. There's been a huge uptick in protests. Of course, we've had a revolution in Kyrgyzstan as well in that time frame, and some unrest. These are protests that focus specifically on China, and they cluster, as you would expect, just with the more kind of liberal environment in Kyrgyzstan in particular, or until recently. There was, of course, a lot more activism, and in Kazakhstan as well, where you saw a more direct overlap, especially on the Xinjiang issue. Many ethnic Kazakhs were detained in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. They're a huge minority population in that province. And especially since the 90s, many of these families have been reunited. They've been trading, engaged in business together. And now many Kazakhs have seen their relatives detained, and that's created a lot of pushback locally. And so there have been a lot of Xinjiang-related protests, people demanding the release of their families, and just putting pressure on the government. That's been a very important development to track and monitor. But then other protests, I guess we can go to the next slide, where I talk about some of the themes. Yeah, that's just more data that we look at. So if you see from 2018 onwards, there's more of a spike in protest activities that we have seen. If we go to the next slide. Oh yeah, and of course, looking at opinion polling, it's also interesting just when we look at the rise of negative sentiments in the region, that as China's engaged more economically and in terms of security, it's also had growing negative sentiments. That was kind of part of what inspired this project. Uzbekistan at the moment remains, I think, for future research, very important to look at. Our book was largely focused on Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, where we're looking at protest data. Most of our interviews took place there. But what's been interesting in Uzbekistan is without any of these overt political flashpoints or kind of mobilization of protest activity on the ground, we've seen the most stark switch around in public opinion. And really, we need to understand more about what's driving negative sentiment in Uzbekistan. I think that that's something that, if we were writing the book today, we'd definitely be focusing on a lot more in depth. We can go to the next slide. So these are kind of the main currents that we track when we're looking at the type of protests. Of course, we've covered the human rights focus and why there's a direct overlap there. There are also land issues. Central Asia, some of these border negotiations with China were highly contentious. Nationalist leaders saw the government as making too many concessions, losing territory. And there's just a deep attachment to the land in Central Asia. So, of course, any protests about land ownership, whether it's allowing land leases to Chinese farmers to develop agriculture, generate a lot of negative pushback and fears of China taking territory. It was a constant trope in interviews with locals. I would hear time and time again that China is a large populous country with a lack of living space. Central Asia, it has a lot of land, but it's very sparsely populated. And so those are kind of the simplification of these land issue narratives, but you'll see that sentiment coming up time and time again in those kind of fears. And of course, there's a recognition of the huge power asymmetries between China and the relatively small states of Central Asia. Labor disputes, very important. When we look at mining sector in particular, a lot of workers that we spoke to in Kazakhstan, there are everything from wage arrears to mistreatment of workers. This creates a lot of labor disputes. So a lot of the activism in general in Central Asia is around labor issues, but a lot of the mines that are attracting the most attention, we've actually ran data on this as well, which was interesting, that of all the foreign-owned mining sites, companies, etc., China overwhelmingly was the one that was most likely to be targeted by protesters or to generate unrest. And often it's because of pretty lax labor conditions there, as well as environmental concerns, ecological issues in the extractive sector, of course, pretty predominant. But with China, there's often a lack of environmental safeguards, focus on sustainability. We have everything from pasture land being damaged to water supplies being polluted, smog, all kinds of issues for locals since Chinese projects have opened. And there's of course, that means that there's very localized concerns, but they often take the shape of deeper suspicion with China. Sovereignty kind of fits in the similar bucket of the land issues. Of course, that's just more general concerns. For example, a lot of discussion and interviews that would come up is the water sharing agreements or lack thereof between Kazakhstan and China. There'd often be fears of China controlling water flows into Kazakhstan as political leverage, as an example of a sovereignty concern. It's not necessarily a land issue. Corruption, of course, there's often perceptions that local elites are benefiting by bringing China into the country, making concessions to China that often don't benefit the local population. Many people view it as selling out their country for Chinese money. Those kind of sentiments would crop up time and time again. And of course, there has been a lot of corruption. especially we look at the power plant deals in Bishkek as a famous example, a corruption scheme. Once these type of projects are kind of unearthed that show corruption and lack of benefits to locals, of course, builds a lot of suspicion toward China, its ambitions. And so the corruption is really undermining China's own long-term interests in favor of short-term gain. And of course, cultural issues. I mean, you see a lot of these nationalist political movements who we interviewed many who will speak about the fear of Chinese moving to Central Asia to marry local women, and this being seen as a major flashpoint issue, particularly in Kyrgyzstan. Or often just, especially after the pandemic, there were a lot of overt racist sentiments toward Chinese. So that's also, there are a lot of these nationalist sentiments and just xenophobic perspectives as well. And if we go to the next slide. Yeah, this is just a little bit more about our data. If we were breaking down our data sets on protests that we're tracking, that's also an interesting point at the bottom, that when we were running regression analysis, we were looking at individuals, the types of threats that they would face for their protest activities out of all protests, not just ones involving China. We found overwhelmingly that protests about China are more sensitive. They're more likely to face police intervention, arrests of individuals involved. So the stakes are quite high, and that just speaks a little bit more about how politically sensitive some of these discussions can be. I guess we can go to the next slide. Yeah, and that's just some examples of some of the interviews. And we did something like almost 100 qualitative interviews across the region with individuals in different sectors, different industries, different connections to the government, and so on. So just to give a sense of what data we're drawing from. Then if we go to the next slide. Yeah, and I'll let Ed talk a little bit more about mining in particular. We'll try and understand just so that we can have a Q&A. We'll kind of move a little bit more quickly.
Sure. So extraction really has been at the center of much of the backlash against China, as it's played an increasing role, as I mentioned, particularly in this sector, not only oil and gas, of course, but also increasingly in critical minerals as well, which of course has taken center stage of the recent visit of the 5 presidents to here in Washington, negotiations with various external powers, including China, that of course dominates the critical minerals industry, accounting for about 60% of rare earth element output and about 90% of processing. And of course, Central Asia is central to China's efforts to remain a monopoly power in these critical mineral supply chains that are essential, especially to kind of various modern technologies, battery production, and so on and so forth. So China controls something like 75% of Tajikistan's gold production, for example. Recently invested $2.7 billion to develop copper and silver deposits in Kazakhstan, controls various lithium mines in Kyrgyzstan. So we could go on, but China plays a key role in this sector. And I think extraction is particularly interesting. We can go to the next slide, because it brings together various of these different strands of backlash that Bradley just spoke about. The concerns around environmental issues, given that mining is a very polluting industry. Concerns around labor rights, given that mining is often a very dangerous sector as well for the workers. Concerns around corruption and the way in which China has often paid bribes in order to get access to these mines, and how these mines are often controlled in joint ventures involving elites who are both benefiting from this extraction, while the individuals in these communities and the people working in these mines are being underpaid and not seeing many of these benefits. And also this idea of resource nationalism, or the way in which mining very starkly shows how the wealth of a country can be extracted by these elites in partnership with foreign partners like China to rob the country of their riches. And so extraction really is at the center of much of this backlash. It's why areas like Western Kazakhstan, where much of the oil and gas and mining industry is based, are particular sources of resistance against China, and particular sites of protest, despite being obviously geographically as far away from China as you could be in the region. So we can see some of the data and protests you can see on the slide in Kyrgyzstan, where over half of Chinese mines were targeted. If we look at our overall data set, as Bradley said, 70% of those foreign businesses targeted in the region, or protests targeting foreign businesses, targeted Chinese businesses. So there is something happening here. And a lot of this is linked to the next slide, which is about the environment and environmental concerns. And you can see the quote there. But I'll hand back to Bradley to talk a little bit about how China's responding before we conclude.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks, Ed. I guess we can go to the next slide. So, of course, just to quickly go through, the Central Asian governments are in a tough spot as a result. They have interests in building their relations with China, diversifying partnerships away from Russia, but there are growing concerns about being too reliant on China, or China just having far too much asymmetric advantage. In addition to that, you have popular sentiments that are often quite xenophobic. So, of course, this constrains your ability to maneuver as well. That maybe you'd like more Chinese security investment or economic investment, but doing so might be politically dangerous. So the Central Asian states have to walk this very tight balancing act between appeasing the public, but without upsetting China. And I think you kind of see that difficulty deftly managed by Kazakhstan, which has been doing these quiet negotiations with China for some releases of ethnic Kazakhs from Xinjiang, where several thousand have been released with the Kazakh government engaging them. This is kind of highly sensitive, but an example of how Central Asian governments do work behind the scenes on occasion to pursue a public-driven agenda, even if it puts them somewhat at odds with China. But of course, their priority is to maintain their relationship with China. So they walk this difficult balancing act. And often other actors, such as the United States, put pressure on Central Asian governments to take a position. I mean, we saw that with Pompeo's visit, where he demanded that they make overt statements on Xinjiang rather than acting quietly behind the scenes. There was a call for overt stance. That places Central Asian governments in a very tricky position. Similarly, with sanctions, the issue of sanctions evasion for Russia going through the region. Calls to overtly take a side on the conflict often, put the Central Asian governments in a very tough spot. And I think that as the US-China rivalry escalates or intensifies these coming years, there'll be a lot more great power pressures for the Central Asian governments to take a stance and not be able to do business with all sides. And I think that that's something they're very worried and nervous about, and it will definitely put a lot of stress on their diplomatic maneuvers in future. If we go to the next slide. And finally, if we go to the next slide as well, please. And finally, we talk about accommodation. So part of the final chapter of the book, we look at China has been invested in the region for decades, has faced some pushback. Is China aware of the pushback? The answer is yes. China is aware of some of what's happening on the ground. There are, of course, information gaps. It sometimes misunderstands the extent of xenophobic sentiments, but largely it's seeking to accommodate. It understands local concerns. I think this is most evident through localization debates around the workforce. There are always concerns that China would create these projects and bring its own workers from China to oversee those projects. It would not benefit locals. It wouldn't create jobs. And I think in recent years, there has been recognition on the China's side about this issue, and there have been a lot more attempts to hire locally and hire even at more senior levels local labor forces. There's of course been a shift. If we go to the next slide. The other thing is, of course, and something we would have loved to have dug into a little bit deeper in the book would be the emergence of Luban workshops. I think that's an interesting initiative by China to upskill local workforces. there are, of course, concerns of China being merely another extractive power, comes in for raw materials, brings them to China, processes them, sells them at a much higher margin than the raw materials it's gaining. So there has been some shift, very minor so far, but an indication that there's understanding of this power asymmetry. And so with Luban workshops, there have been some investments in car production facilities as well for Chinese green vehicles. I think it's important. It just shows that China recognizes that there is desire for skilling of the labor force in Central Asia. Of course, we focus a lot. We do interviews with folks at Confucius Institutes looking at Chinese scholarships and opportunities for Central Asians to work in China. So these are all the strategies through which China tries to engage with some of the pushback and critical feedback loops. But of course, we speak a little bit more about how they're falling short and how some of these initiatives, even looking at college scholarships, only 40,000 or so Central Asians study in China today. That's a very small number when compared with Russia, which receives over 200,000, for example. So in terms of China's economic pool, it could be doing a lot more in the region than it currently does. And I guess we'll keep that for the Q&A, and I think we can wrap up there.
Thank you so much. Maybe we can remove the slides so we can see faces better. Let me invite questions, and we're already receiving really good questions. So I'll cut mine and prepare the bunch based on the book, but let me limit myself to two. The title of the book is Backlash: China's Struggle for Influence in Central Asia, and that's the main theme of your book. And you talk about protests, you talk about the kind of the efforts to kind of modify, reshape, and so on. But as Bradley, you qualified at the beginning, the book is kind of is bigger than this theme. And there are bits in it that show that kind of there is a lot of interest in the region in China's engagement. And in this regard, maybe we don't have time for that, but I thought it would be a nice mental exercise to think what would have happened to the region, what the region would have been like if China hadn't engaged so much, right? If China, maybe the economic reforms were kind of less successful there. If China were more dormant, and like, what would we have in Central Asia? It would be a very different place, right? And some things maybe would be for worse, but some things, some things maybe would have been better. We don't know, but some would have been for worse. So China definitely is just such a big force in Central Asia. And it's a relationship. I think you are very rightly kind of emphasize it, that it is a relationship. There is a lot of local agency, right, at different levels. These are governments, these are people, businessmen, some like small communities in remote places, and so on. That's here. Maybe if you want to say something about that, that'll be great. Kind of how do you understand the opportunities and the local interests and so on? And they're not always kind of bad actors with bad interests. And the second one on your last. On the last point about accommodation, I think it's very, very interesting. And here, let me quote a sentence from your book. While China is a growing hegemony, it exists in a state of negotiated hegemony, recalibrates its decisions and interests to fit with those espoused by local regimes, businesses, and population alike. How does that compare to the US hegemony, right? And is this adaptability a strength or weakness down the road? Let me stop here, and then I'll go to the questions from the audience.
Okay, I guess I can take the first one. I'll let Ed take more of the second. But yeah, you're very right to point out, what would the future of the region have been without China's growth in the region. And just again, we've been putting a lot of disclaimers about the book. Although we're focused on backlash, we're of course in no ways implying that China's influence is solely negative, or anything like that. We're really exploring China's rise as a fact and some of the missteps that it makes and the lessons it's learned in its engagement. And so I think this process happens with all great powers when they become strategically important in a given region. Maybe they'll overplay their hand, they'll misunderstand local needs, or they'll just be testing waters to see what they can get away with and where the limits are. And so I think that a lot of these positions, or the negotiated hegemony, as it were, it's important to it's why local agency is so important, that it does bring those critical feedback loops and it does force changes and a more healthy relationship and equilibrium. Without China, of course, the region would most likely be far more dominated by Russia than it currently is. So I think that China has given a lot of strategic flexibility, which is very important. I think, as we see with the conflict in Ukraine, Russia's statements, especially with Kazakhstan questioning its sovereignty, its nationhood, talks about the Russian minority in the north of Kazakhstan. I think that a Russia being more dominant would just lead to more colonial attitudes, and a lot more political pressure and leverage. I think that China does put safeguards and some degree of protections for the Central Asian governments because it is an investor and stakeholder in the region. And that does mean that China has concerns for the region that does limit some of Russia's more potentially aggressive ambitions. As for the US and Europe, I think that there's been, whether they have filled the vacuum if China hadn't filled it, I think very unlikely. I think that there's also been a lack of creativity in the West about Central Asia and its greater role, both in international security and just in world politics as a region in and of itself being important. It's always just been seen as a front for the war on terror or the conflict in Afghanistan. And so investments were quite limited, opportunities for locals were very limited as well. I think, in a way, China being interested in the region may have actually led to people in the West thinking about it more and its strategic importance. I think China has also been, for better or worse, a driving factor in how the West is now perceiving the region.
And on the negotiated hegemony, I don't think China is unique in this regard, right? What we're seeing is a region that's increasingly being courted by various powers. We have a chapter on kind of multi-vectorism and agency and kind of how we should view the region in this growing multipolar system. And, I think the region certainly benefits from having greater interest from America, the EU, the Gulf states, China, Russia. And so I think each of these countries is increasing, each of these external powers is increasingly coming up against a region that is trying to assert itself, and obviously to varying degrees, Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan being better placed to do so, but are extracting certain benefits from the deals. Of course, the Central Asian republics are very happy that the Trump administration has dropped any pretense towards human rights and these other concerns, criticisms of their authoritarian governance systems, and that the meeting between Trump and the five presidents in Washington earlier this month was really just about making deals and deals that some of the demands of which came from the Central Asian side. It wasn't wholly being dictated by Washington, and so I think China's facing a similar reality. Of course, it has more leverage than the United States in the region, than any other external actor except for Russia, but ultimately, I think it can be advantageous insofar as it can frame some of these approaches, some of these deals as being mutually beneficial. But I'll leave it there so we can go to some audience Q&A.
Yes, I meant the kind of differences in approaches. If we take the US pre-Trump, right, where it saw itself as a carrier of certain values and kind of it knew what's better. In a sense, the European Union remains kind of in this vein that there are best practices there, right? And there are a set of values they believe in and they want to promote, and some values dear to us, people like us, kind of liberties,
Sure.
and
which I think are important, and a lot of the kind of practices that, of course, foreign investors in the country aren't perfect, but the kind of corporate social responsibility they have, the kind of the benefits that they give to their workers, the attention they pay to not damaging the environment. I think there is a reason why Chinese businesses are targeted disproportionately, and part of that is because they are, they're engaging in investments that do provide fewer benefits, at least to many of the local communities who are perceived as such. And so, yeah, I think certainly, we would say that investors and actors like the United States and the European Union, when they're engaging with the region, should try and differentiate themselves from China in terms of the values and the kind of the value added that they bring in that regard.
So, okay. But at the same time, you argue that there should be certain accommodation, right? In the book, you say they should be tailored, right, to the needs, but at the same time there is a comparative advantage, you would say, right, that the collective West has.
Yeah, I think being
Yes, it is
adaptive
capital.
and accommodating doesn't necessarily mean you have to kind of throw out any concerns over things like the environment or corruption or so on and so
Well,
forth.
China cares about the environment.
Yeah,
Actually, if anything, if we compare US now and China,
yeah,
right, it's China that is a champion of
yeah.
green,
Energy and
yeah, sustainable development, all that. Okay, let me move to the questions. We're staying in this geopolitical lane. What changes do you see since the invasion of Ukraine in 2022? Do you think Russia's distraction because of the war has created new openings for China? Who
take that
wants to take
quickly.
that?
Yeah, I think one thing we've seen is, at least in terms of the public opinion data, in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan has been a kind of a warming towards China that we could, or at least a decrease in the number of kind of xenophobic sentiments in the country from public opinion data, whilst we've seen obviously an increasing, especially in Kazakhstan, negative attitudes towards Russia. And so I think the two are probably linked. China, Xi Jinping, of course, came to Tashkent and Astana shortly, well, 6 months after the beginning of the kind of escalation of the invasion in February 2022, and talked about defending the sovereignty of and maintaining the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. And so China's been able to position itself as a partner to the region that isn't threatening in the way that Russia is, that isn't exploitative in the way that Russia is. So I would say it certainly has opened up opportunities for China to improve its image, both kind of by comparison to Russia, and also, of course, the kind of more practical elements of Russia being distracted with the war in Ukraine. So it's something, again, we delved into in the book, but it would be, it's something that I think requires more attention and is a future kind of research agenda.
Thank you. We have questions about your field work. Over the course of your 10 years of fieldwork in Central Asia, have you encountered challenges related to building or maintaining trust with local communities? And how did these dynamics influence your research process and findings? Were there moments of resistance or mistrust? And there's a question about language or languages you conducted the interviews in, and also how you identified who to interview. How do these factors impact your findings?
Yeah, I think those are great questions, and of course, speak a lot to some of the limitations of the study. I mean, looking at languages, for example, they're almost all in either Russian or English for the interview sourcing. So that, of course, means a lot of urban bias in the data sets. It misses a lot of important dynamics in Central Asia where local languages, there's often different perceptions of different actors. I mean, we've seen in Kyrgyzstan with the rise of Japarov how Kyrgyz language, often rural communities speaking in Kyrgyz rather than the Russian speaking intelligentsia of the urban environments. They had very different political views, a lot more populist messaging. And so I think engaging in local languages would be quite fascinating and reveal a lot more different sentiments toward China than people in urban communities who are Russian speakers or even English language speakers for that matter. So that's, yeah, I think the language is a very big limitation of the study, and I would love to see researchers kind of push that agenda forward, especially looking at online discourse. It's similar to another question which mentioned the types of pushback. We, of course, look at protests, but we also look at some social media campaigns. We look at messaging that's spread over media apps, but those kind of soft forms of protests are covered much less extensively or systematically in our book than kind of the hard on the ground protests. So I think that there's a lot more research needs to be done in understanding how social media has really changed the way these campaigns can be conducted and the way that people engage with politics in the region. And then finally, in terms of sourcing, of course, that does create some limitations in our study. A lot of people are very hesitant to speak on this topic. We've mentioned the stakes are much higher, essentially, for perceived anti-China activism and so on. So a lot of people don't want to speak, or at least they want to maintain their anonymity. In fact, every interview in our book is anonymized for that reason, that it would be potentially problematic for people. In terms of outreach, we've of course relied on a lot of local interlocutors as well, because it's sometimes easier to gain trust with certain communities through having contacts who are already deep and trusted by those sources. So that creates some limitations in terms of, it'd be better if we could stay there in the region long term and actually develop these community relationships ourselves. But there are often a lot of limitations for that reason. And Ed, I don't know if you wanted to add anything.
No, just that researching China is increasingly controversial. We mentioned, I think, in the introduction, the case of Roshana Hakimova, a Tajik researcher who conducted kind of opinion polling, where one of the questions was related to China and was arrested and accused of being a spy. So, certainly there are risks, and the Central Asian governments and China is concerned around negative publicity in the region, and so we were. Try to be as cautious as possible in conducting our field work, and because the real dangers involved.
There is a question about the what seems to be a trend of more Chinese citizens coming to Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan and purchasing real estate, starting to work in industries. Have you seen this trend? Do you have any data on that issue? I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's, I think there is publicly released data, at least official statistics from Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan on kind of migrants. And, again, like any data on migration, it can be a little fuzzy, and the kind of, and there's a lot of kind of, there's the public perception, especially in Kyrgyzstan, of the level of Chinese migration and the reality that the government puts forward in terms of number of visas issued, work permits issued, and so on and so forth are vastly different. And I don't think we've seen a massive uptick in Chinese migration to the region, at least according to the public figures. But in many ways, our book points to how the perceptions are often more important. And if people imagine that there's an increase in migration and that they view this as part of some kind of conspiracy by the Chinese Communist Party to bring over send more Chinese citizens to the country to then use it as a reason to take back territories that Chinese nationalist historians would claim are part of China, then that's in fact more important. So I think, the statistics that we have access to don't point to a massive increase, and they point to the levels actually being lower than most people would expect. We haven't, I don't know, Bradley, who picked up on any concerns around real estate purchases. Of course, we sort of picked up broader concerns more around kind of Chinese investments and growing dependence on China, and the role of Chinese businesses in local communities, often only employing Chinese employees, or at least the perception that they did, but less so about real estate. But that would be an interesting thing to look into.
Mm-hmm.
Because obviously in other parts of the world, it's a great concern, in America, for example, in Europe.
Two questions about kind of the areas outside Central Asia. Do you think the Trump corridor, the Zanzibar corridor, will impact the BRI, and how does China's engagement with Afghanistan fit into its Central Asia strategy? Do you think it's about genuine economic integration, or simply China securing its own borders and mineral interests, or maybe both?
Well, I think, the middle corridor is an area where there is a convergence of interests between the United States, the European Union, and China, right? And, it wasn't originally one of the corridors of Belt and Road Initiative, but China's, more recent maps do show, a Chinese corridor of BRI that would go across the Caspian Sea. And so obviously China is concerned around the viability of continuing to export goods via Russia and through Ukraine and Belarus, obviously, which were the original kind of much of the Belt and Road infrastructure went through Kazakhstan and up to Europe that way. Of course, that's become less viable. So there is China is investing in port infrastructure in, as we know, in the Caucasus and Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan. And so, I think it is an area of potential convergence of interests, although, of course, there's less of an appetite, at least in Washington, to collaborate, more so in Brussels and the European capitals. But I'd say there is a convergence there. Bradley, I don't know if you want to talk about Afghanistan.
I mean, just more generally, I mean, on convergence, I mean, I think that's an important point, and kind of what we make clear is that this US-China rivalry, it's important not to pull other actors into that dynamic and understand that there is a lot of convergence, whether that's developing infrastructure, for example. That infrastructure is not necessarily a political objective of China or the US. The infrastructure can be beneficial, trade can be a net good. And Central Asia has shown itself to be a region that's willing to work with multiple different actors, and of course, try and accommodate their needs. And so I think that, it's important, again, not to let great power rivalries spill over into the way that we engage critical regions like Central Asia. In Afghanistan, of course, there's a lot of Chinese interest in the critical minerals potential of Afghanistan. There's the large concerns going across the region with security dynamics, the potential for spillover of instability, also just the potential for humanitarian crisis. I think that there are genuine efforts and a sincere commitment toward helping Afghans, but at the moment, it's very hard to tell to what degree they're willing to get deeply involved in any way, especially on the ground.
And the last question, what is the most important trend, if any, related to China's engagement with Central Asia you have identified? How does that trend compare in speed, pace to other trends, developments happening in the region?
I guess I can go first. I think the interesting thing to look at in the region, and we kind of touch on it a little bit, is this kind of China's increasing investments outside of extraction, right? It's now building electric vehicle plants in Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, right? It's opening these Luban workshops that are structured in ways that kind of suit, they're focused on AI, they're focused on hydrology, they're focused on kind of robotics and, and critical, energy infrastructure. And so, the way in which China's trying to move its investments away from kind of infrastructure and extraction towards kind of higher levels in the supply chain. I think that's a move that has an economic logic for China, right? To, offshore production to areas with cheaper labor costs, but also I think it does have a kind of soft power element to it insofar as, these investments can bring more value to local communities, can, increase people's human capital, push Central Asia up the supply chain, and I think that's kind of something we pick up on in the book, and that's a trend that we've seen relatively recently. I'd say over the past, becoming more intense over the past 5 years, and as we move towards China's greater investments in areas like green technology, AI in the region, we'll see where that goes.
I guess I'll just add a final point on, just to emphasize the subtitle of the book, China's Struggle for Influence. I think a key trend is that despite its overwhelming economic, political influence, China's been successful when it comes to building relationships with elites, not just in Central Asia, but around the world, but is very bad so far at making good relations with publics at large. China's far more comfortable with state to state diplomacy and so on than it is engaging publics. And I think that is quite telling. It's quite remarkable almost that China's failed to convert all that economic influence into genuine soft power influence. And I think that makes China very vulnerable to populist pushback, the type of politics that could actually unsettle its investments long term.
Yes. At the same time, as you point out in the book, um, the opinions have been changing, right? Like in Kazakhstan, for sure, we see an improvement in Kyrgyzstan as well. In Uzbekistan, it's a slightly different, somewhat different picture, but the image of China has been improving, and I think to kind of a lot has to do with the overall China's level of development. That China is now kind of this high-tech place, and with lots of opportunities. And let me squeeze in the last question we got about the future, about China in the future. Uh, is it taking over the world with tech and futuristic ideas? Will it be the most important country in the world? That will be a giant discussion. Let me modify it and ask you, what do you think is going to happen over the next 5-10 years in China-Central Asia relations, like in very, very broad terms? I know like things might change. It's very hard to
Big
predict
questions, right? And
anything,
there are lots
but
of different
kind
schools
of
of thought.
drawing on the trends that we've seen, right? Unless there are some major disruptions.
Yeah, I
What's going
think
to happen?
apart from the potential for major disruptions, that would include obviously changes of power, that would include, some kind of protracted economic crisis brought on in China or Central Asia or other, we've seen a lot of exogenous shocks over the past 5 years, right? Which we wouldn't have predicted, such as COVID, such as the withdrawal from Afghanistan, the escalation in Ukraine. These have all been big shocks for the region. So excluding that, if we see a kind of continuity of kind of the norm that we're seeing, I think more of the same. I think the gradual decline of Russia in the region will continue, at least in certainly economically, and China will continue to capitalize on that. I think obviously we're not going to see over the next 20 years, let's say, we're not going to see another tenfold increase, to $1 trillion of trade a year. I just don't think that's feasible. So I think, China's obviously this curve is already started to flatten off. But I think we'll see an intensification of China, particularly, as I say, in the trend seems to be towards these kind of AI and green energy and, really production of electric vehicles. And so I think that will, I expect, reduce the amount of Sinophobia in the region. I think in the longer term, we are seeing China adapting its approach. As we said, we are seeing the Central Asian publics. Maybe China's not able to attract them, but really it doesn't need to attract them. It just needs to make them accept China's growing role in the region. So I think for me, it's more of the same. Probably quite a safe bet.
And Bradley, what do you think? Do you
Yeah,
agree?
I would argue as well, more of the same. I think that in terms of security and so on, I think we've seen that China's a very hesitant great power to get deeply involved. I mean, whether it was the border conflict between the Kyrgyz and Tajiks, or the unrest in Kyrgyzstan's revolution, we've really seen that China kind of takes a backseat on those type of things. And often, especially regimes, they ultimately turn to Russia when it comes to their preservation. And there's a lot more trust with Russia. So in terms of security, I don't see China displacing Russia entirely anytime soon. I think it gives them a little bit of strategic flexibility, but it's not going to replace Russia anytime soon. Same kind of on the soft power level. I mean, I think that we might see a lot more investments with China in terms of Central Asian labor, as we see labor costs in China are rising dramatically. So I think it's no coincidence that strategic regions like Central Asia are getting these kind of car manufacturing plants and local deals. So I would expect to see a lot more of that. In terms of scholarships, fellowships, there may be a slight uptick, but I don't know if it's again going to overtake Russia anytime soon. And especially in terms of Russia's role as a hub for migration and opportunities for Central Asian workers, China is very constrained in that regard. I mean, we saw this even with the debates around the US and its restrictions on its visas and H-1Bs. China announced trying to kind of take advantage of that capital, but there was a lot of controversy domestically, people worrying about foreigners coming in and stealing high-paying jobs in China. So I think that China also faces similar anti-immigrant sentiments and so on that will constrain a lot of its ability to actually capitalize on the Central Asian labor market. So I would expect more of the same, pretty limited growth.
Great. Great. Well, excellent. Let's get together in 5 years and we'll
Let's
start with
do
these
it.
predictions and see what actually happened. Well, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Edward and Bradley, for being with us today, for telling us about your book and sharing your thoughts and insights. And thank you, people who joined us, the viewers here and on YouTube, for tuning in. And let me encourage you to buy the book. It's very rich, even for people for somebody like me who has been following China Central relations for kind of over the decades. Still, there was plenty of new information, and I found it definitely thought-provoking. So buy the book and keep in touch. Tune in to our future events, and also big thanks to our team here at the Davis Center, Laura and Lucy, who helped us organize this event. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much.